Hello, I'm Gareth Westwood, Head of Global Intelligence at Sibylline, and welcome to another Sibylline Insights podcast. Today, calling in remotely from sunny Lincolnshire, and I'm delighted that we have Brady and Alex Marciniak also calling in remotely, so thank you so much for your time. Now, we are recording this on the 12th of February 2025, and of course this subject is an extremely dynamic topic to explore. So things could change between now and release, but we're hoping not. Obviously, if things do change, we are covering all of the topics discussed today in our regular reporting that you can access via the caption. But without further ado, let's look at the topic at hand. And Claire, it's been a very busy month for the Americas desk, to say the least. And I know we're going to look at specifically today Canada and Mexico in terms of tariffs. But just briefly for our listeners and viewers, can you kind of list all the tariffs that Donald Trump might have promised, instigated, or even delayed as briefly as we can, just to put this in context?
Yeah, of course. So first, I'll bring us back to February 1st, when Trump originally imposed a 25% blanket tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico. The only exclusion to this was that Canadian oil and gas would only face a 10% tariff. Now, 2 days later, this tariff was paused after both Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum promised Trump to make improvements on border security. And so he paused this tariff until March 4th. Now, as of yesterday, Trump has also imposed a 25% tariff on aluminum and steel from all countries around the world. And further, he has also promised to impose reciprocal tariffs on any country that charges duties on U.S. imports. And specifically on Canada, he has also threatened tariffs specifically on Canadian automobiles. So that's where we're at so far. The only one that is currently being implemented is the aluminum and steel tariff.
Thank you, Claire. That makes it a bit clearer. And before we look at the impact specifically on Mexico and then Canada. What was Donald Trump's thinking here? What's the rationale? What's the strategy behind these particular tariffs?
Yeah, so Donald Trump is using a very transactional strategy, and he's using these tariffs as leverage to procure any type of a better deal for the U.S. Now, whether this is just a perceived win or a real one, he is using tariffs to address a number of grievances that he has with these countries nationwide. Now, on Canada and Mexico, his specific grievances were that neither country was doing enough to stop the flow of illegal migrants and illegal fentanyl through their borders and into the U.S. So his threat of tariffs was completely conditional on if these countries did more to bolster their border security and really create some tangible metrics to show that they are stopping the flow of these drugs and migrants through the border.
So just before we move on to yourself, Alex, and we'll cover this more at the end, is it fair to say then that listeners and viewers and those wishing to preempt tariffs to shore up their own business operations should look at the US president's grievances as cited, for example, in the campaign trail, his political grievances, as opposed to any other kind of strategy?
Yeah, exactly. I think he's actually been quite clear in what his main priorities are. He's always said it's been addressing illegal immigration, and that's what we saw with Canada and Mexico. Now, around the world, the situation changes a little bit. His grievances with the EU are a little bit different. He claims that the EU is just getting a better deal on everything, and the US is giving special treatment. So the situation will change a little bit, but when it comes to Canada and Mexico, we have seen so far signals that as these countries attempt to address this critical problem of migration and drug trafficking, that tariffs can be delayed or shelved completely.
So I guess if I'm a business owner or chief security officer or any other stakeholder in this, I should also be looking at what my country specifically, my government's policy is, or the affected government's policy is, in reaction to the tariffs, in order to judge, the severity of their imposition or the likelihood of their imposition. And this is where we're going to move to Alex. Alex, thank you so much for joining us once again. And in terms of that, what has Mexico done? What is Mexico doing? And how has it affected Mexico, be it the threat of tariffs or, even the ones stated in the initial gambit there?
So Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has approached Donald Trump and the Trump administration with a strategy of appeasement. So giving in to his demands or trying to pander to his demands with domestic policies. Since the declaration of tariffs, the Mexican security forces have deployed 10,000 National Guard members to the US-Mexico border. This has involved moving troops from other locations in Mexico, such as Estado Mexico, from Puebla, from Veracruz, to the border regions to reinforce the security presence already there. In addition, the Mexican security forces have continued their crackdown on irregular migration through their territory. This has included increasing migrant detentions, even since President Sheinbaum's inauguration on the 1st of October in 2024. The Mexican security forces have detained upwards of 450,000 migrants transiting its territory, which marks an escalation in this posture. And at the US-Mexico border in the coming near term or so, we're likely to see increase in fentanyl seizures in order to appease the Trump administration and an increase in migrant detentions. Also, reports have indicated that Mexico has received non-Mexican deportees from the US in another way to show the Trump administration that they are playing ball, if you will.
And, has this had any effect on the way that businesses operate, the commercial operations, supply chain, people, assets, etc., or has it largely not affected how things are run in Mexico at the moment from the commercial side of things?
From the commercial side, for sure, businesses are feeling the pressure, and I think that when tariffs, or if tariffs are put in place officially without a sort of negotiation, we're likely to see a significant increase in supply chain risks. Businesses will likely preempt the imposition of tariffs by expediting shipments, causing significant supply chain disruptions at the border during the period of the imposition and then shortly afterwards, as well as backlogs are created. Also, the supply chain reconfiguration that we'll see if tariffs are put in place will cause significant disruption. But at the time being, there hasn't been a significant change in the way that businesses are operating. It's more a concern and looking forward towards future tariff impositions.
So would you say if tariffs are imposed to a lesser or greater degree, it's supply chain that would be the most affected part of business operations, certainly in the short term?
Yeah, the first order implication for sure is the supply chain reconfiguration. But then second order implications, you're looking at more operational costs, for instance, for importers, vice versa. We assess that if tariffs are imposed by the Trump administration, the Mexican government will likely impose retaliatory tariffs as a measure itself. So it will likely impose operational costs on both sides of the border.
And have we seen any indication of civil unrest, protests, that kind of more tactical activity that can sometimes be associated with immigration policy, or at least a change in immigration policy?
We've seen sporadic protests against the Mexican government's harder line on immigration and treatment of migrants. We've seen an increase in migrant camp clearances across the country. For instance, in the border in Chihuahua State recently, there was an episode of unrest at a migrant camp where they burned down the camp and got into sporadic clashes with security forces. So we are seeing this antagonism between, but by and large, it's not a significant uptick in the domestic unrest picture.
Thank you, Alex. And maybe we'll come back to you for more of a long-term forecast, if that's okay. But I want to go to Canada, go to Claire to talk about Canada. Similarly, what has the Canadian government done, or are they doing in this period, in this 30-day hiatus? And then maybe go on to, in the longer term, especially with the political situation as it is in Canada, what do we see as their medium to longer term policy stance in order to avoid, these tariffs?
Yeah, so we've seen Trudeau and the Canadians react quite similarly to Mexico. They also promised Trump to advance a $1.3 billion border security plan and to really step up coordination with U.S. officials, including a Canada-U.S. joint strike force that would operate at the border. Ottawa also committed to creating a fentanyl czar in their government, which would oversee, the trafficking of this drug and really putting a halt to it. And they also promised to list Mexican organized crime groups as terrorists under Canadian law. So that was everything they gave Trump. At this point, and now in this 30-day period, both Mexico City and Washington, D.C., as well as Ottawa and Washington, D.C., are continuing negotiations and will try to finalize an economic deal to keep these tariffs permanently at bay.
And I'm interested, those watching, social media or, the LinkedIn networking sites, etc., would have seen lots of reactions and clips from various Canadian politicians. How has it affected commercial and business operations so far? The threat of tariffs, if you will, has it caused significant disruption? And second to that, should the tariffs be implemented, should the negotiations fail, what again would you see as the maybe first and second order effects for business operations, people and places in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's been similar impacts as Mexico. We've seen exporters kind of rush to ship things off before tariffs are imposed. So within the U.S., there was data released in December and January that import rates were way up as, companies both from Canada and Mexico really looked to get things in before the tariffs are imposed. And we've just seen a lot of companies looking to their government and really pressuring the Canadian government to do more on this because there isn't a lot that these companies can do right now until they know what is actually going to be imposed. So again, we haven't seen that operational disruption yet, but what we have seen is a lot of sectors really pressuring the Canadian government. Now, in the long term, if tariffs are reimposed, that will have significant operational impacts in Canada. First and foremost, on the supply chain, disruption across the border would definitely be delayed. But what we would really see is major impacts to the oil and gas sector, the automotive sector, and agriculture as well. Those are the three that would really be impacted, both within Canada and within the U.S., as these sectors are really tightly intertwined across the border, and it would highly impact both. But socioeconomically, Canada would be hit very hard. We're looking at, their GDP contracting. Some economists are saying up to even 5% if 25% tariffs are imposed, a loss of $60 billion over about 3 years. So their economy would definitely be hit, and consumers would feel it at, places like the grocery store, at the gas pump, everything like that.
It's really interesting. Thank you, Claire. And going forward, Alex, how do you think Sheinbaum will, proceed following this 30-day, negotiation period? Say the tariffs aren't, implemented in the next 30 days. We've got another 4 years. How do you think the Mexican government will adjust their policy positions in order to avert any potential tariffs and the potential impact those could have within Mexico?
In the long term, the Mexican government and under Claudia Sheinbaum is highly likely to continue its policy of appeasement. We've seen recent U-turns on policies, such as with a recent GM corn policy reversal, but also the imposition of tariffs on China by Mexico. Mexico's imposed a 19% tariff on e-commerce retailers in China, such as Shein and Temu, in order to signal to the US government, who's made allegations against Mexico, that Mexico is a backdoor for Chinese cheaper imports. So regulatory policies like this might also change in the sort of short to medium term. But in addition, we'll likely see a continuation of these security crackdowns to prove to the US that Mexico is doing something to stop fentanyl trafficking. Additionally, much like with Canada and the US. Mexico is committed to increasing cooperation with the US law enforcement agencies to stop fentanyl trafficking. We see it as highly unlikely to a remote possibility that there's any US military action within Mexico in the coming 12 months. But having an increase of US advisory positions linked to Mexican security forces is a likely possibility in the short to medium term. So in sum, Mexico will highly likely continue this appeasement strategy that it's taken up to this point.
And so, Alex, okay, we're not going to have JSOC operators on the ground in Mexico. Sheinbaum's going to have to, react with a more punitive or aggressive stance towards these cartels and their means to earn revenue. Is that not going to increase organized crime and security force clashes, in the short term, at least until they get a handle on it? Are we not going to see an explosion in violence as this policy takes place? Or do you think this, is an effective method of combating organized crime, which of course she was brought in originally to do?
Yeah, so Claudia Sheinbaum's security strategy marks a deviation from her predecessor, former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who followed a hugs not bullets strategy focusing on social care and stopping the root causes of criminality, whereas Sheinbaum's administration in the past 5 months or so has shown a much more assertive and confrontational security strategy. In terms of what this means for armed clashes between the security forces and organized crime groups, I assess that we're likely to see an uptick in the short to medium term, especially if fentanyl seizures increase significantly. If fentanyl seizures increase significantly, this likely hurt cartels' bottom line, which will likely push them towards finding other routes to get their criminal incomes, such as increasing cargo thefts, increasing extortion, increasing kidnappings, these sorts of secondary criminal activities that we see organized crime groups do. If the crackdown on fentanyl becomes so harsh that this is drawing too much attention to organized crime groups from their perspective, there's a realistic possibility we see the heads of these organized crime groups, such as the Sinaloa cartel, call for halts to fentanyl production. We saw the Los Chapitos faction in 2023 impose a similar ban on fentanyl production in their areas of Sinaloa. If we see this take place, there's a realistic possibility that we see increasing factionalism within cartels as they vie for power, as some factions decide to comply with this internal ban and others don't and are fought back against. So regardless of the situation of whether we see a fentanyl ban or not, I assess there will likely be an uptick in these clashes and insecurity at the border, which will have secondary consequences, likely supply chain disruptions as we see increasing checkpoints and security force posture, also increasing physical security risks and secondary criminality risks.
Absolutely, thank you. And Claire, I'm going to close in a moment with a border strategy question that we kind of touched on earlier. But in terms of the cartel terrorism thing, I know the subject of this is tariffs. But, do we see the US deploying at any point? I know Alex said, almost certainly not this year. And you obviously came to that conclusion jointly within the Americas desk. Was this just symbolism, or, do we see anything, beyond this year that could signal a movement in US military activity in Mexico?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think the potential designation of Mexican organized crime groups as foreign terrorist organizations, FTO designation that we always talk about, it's seen among the US political community that this is kind of the first step in getting a legal basis for justifying using U.S. military or intelligence agencies to fight against these cartels. So again, we're not there yet in the year, probably not even next 2 years, but we just took the first step, essentially. So the legal foundation is being laid. And I think even domestically within the U.S., Trump, he currently just gave buyout offers to a number of different intelligence agencies, including the CIA, in an attempt to kind of reshape these agencies to his priorities. And we know his, number one priority, if not in the top three, is cracking down on illegal immigration and fentanyl trafficking. So it does stand to reason that he wants to pivot these agencies kind of to focus more on these issues. In the longer term, it is a possibility that we start to see more collaboration between U.S. and Mexican forces at the border, specifically to combat cartels.
And if my producer's listening, looking at the US intelligence community and what's going on there, that might be another podcast. Who knows? However, we need to close this one. So very last question, Claire. We talked on it earlier a bit. We got 4 years now. What should folks be looking out for in terms of Trump's tariff strategy? Because, of course, it does have eventual impact on the running of business operations. Even the threat of tariffs we've seen had an impact on, supply chains, etc., and exporting, let alone tariffs themselves. So what should folks listening and watching this be looking out for over the next 4 years that we haven't discussed already?
Yeah, I think I would say don't take Trump's words as just noise. When it comes to tariffs, we have seen so far that the threats he was making during his campaign months ago are actually what he is trying to follow through on now. And he brings up a lot of sectors often. He talks a lot about the oil and gas industry, the automotive industry, energy in general. I would say those are the sectors that, firms really need to be concerned about if they are in. And yeah, just taking his words as an actual warning. And I think it's also worth, whatever country a business is operating in, listen to what your government is also saying, because we've seen a lot of foreign leaders are saying what their plan is going to be to try to dissuade Trump. So, we saw it in Canada. They said we were going to put retaliatory tariffs on Kentucky bourbon and Florida oranges as, an attempt to try to get Trump to back off. And we've seen other leaders do it in the EU, for example. They're saying what they're going to do. So my advice would just be to listen to that and to get ready.
So, Claire, what we can say is that geopolitics and indeed domestic politics has the potential to have an outsized impact on business operations, people and assets over the coming years, as it always has. And of course, you can ask us any questions you'd like by emailing us at the email shown in the caption. We do look forward to seeing you again, and we do hope you found this insightful. Do visit our social media pages, and of course, remember to like and subscribe. But we look forward to seeing you at the next edition, and until then, do be safe.